साइकोलॉजी की प्रिंसिपल्स जितनी भी हैं, जो भी आपने G1 में किया था, you learned about probably memory, learning processes, how do we think, what are the attentional processes that we have. तो ये सारी साइकोलॉजिकल प्रिंसिपल्स एंड जो हमारी थियोरीज है, उन सबको अगर हम सोशल सेटिंग में अप्लाई करें, सोशल सेटिंग क्या क्या हो सकती है? कोई एग्जांपल देगा यहाँ पर? कोई एग्जांपल दे यहाँ पे क्लास में मुझे. What can all be included in social situations? बताइए बताइए. सुबह सुबह है तो मुझे पता है कि और भी क्लास नहीं हुई है, कि आप थके हुए. Yes, don't force me to come back. नंदिनी. Why is everybody so silent? Harleen, what about you? I'm asking a very simple question. What all you can include in social situations?
Conflict.
Meeting with friends, somebody writes. Dipansha.
Conflicts.
I can't hear you. Can you repeat that?
Conflicts, that fights and all.
तो पहले कॉन्फ्लिक्ट, चलो कॉन्फ्लिक्ट ऑफ व्हाट? फॉर एग्जाम्पल आपने कॉन्फ्लिक्ट कर दिया. सोशल सेटिंग में और क्या क्या आ सकता है? कौन कौन सी सिचुएशन सोशल सिचुएशन? मीटिंग विद फ्रेंड्स अच्छा एग्जाम्पल दिया किसी ने, बताइए. ये सब तो आपने, इट्स नॉट अबाउट दैट यू नो साइकोलॉजी और डोंट नो साइकोलॉजी, यू लिव इन अ सोशल सेटिंग. ऐसा नहीं कि आप एग्जाम्पल नहीं दे पाएंगे. हम लोग तो दिन भर में कितनी हजार बार रेफर करते हैं कि लोग क्या कहेंगे, सोसाइटी क्या कहेगी. व्हाट डू वी मीन बाय दोस सिचुएशंस? कहते हैं ना, बातें करते हैं हम लोग. यस और नो? Come on, you have to think. You live in so you live in a social situation. Can't you give me examples?
Ma'am, it would be any situation where we interact with people.
Exactly, it could be any situation where we interact with other people. It could be a situation. It can be a family. It can be bus stop पे जो लोग खड़े हैं वो crowd हो गए सकती है social situation. You know, any setting wherein suppose it's classroom is a social situation. So any situation where you're interacting with any other person, any other individual or group of individuals, it can be referred to a social situation, right? तो ये बहुत बड़ा मुश्किल आंसर तो था नहीं, right? So when we try to understand people, to understand nature and causes of behavior in a particular situation, that becomes the subject matter of social psychology. सोशल साइकोलॉजी में लोग कैसे इंटरेक्ट करते हैं, उनकी क्या थॉट प्रोसेसेस हैं, किस तरह के स्टीरियोटाइप्स होते हैं, क्यों रखते हैं, क्या प्रेजुडिसेस है, इंटरग्रुप रिलेशंस कैसे होते हैं. इतने सारे कॉन्फ्लिक्ट्स के बारे में किसी ने बात करी कि व्हाई डू वी हैव कॉन्फ्लिक्ट्स बिटवीन हिंदू मुस्लिम्स, व्हाई डू वी हैव कॉन्फ्लिक्ट्स बिटवीन क्रिश्चियंस एंड वेरियस रिलीजियस ग्रुप्स, व्हाई डू वी हैव कॉन्फ्लिक्ट्स बिटवीन conflicts between in the sense that Dalit groups में versus higher economic groups में. So why is there is any kind of situation? Why do people do not help anybody who is going through some accident on the road? Why do they move away? So any situation where we try to learn कि क्यों लोग ऐसा करते हैं, क्यों इस तरह से बिहेव करते हैं, क्या कारण हो सकता है, ये सारी चीज़ें हम सोशल साइकोलॉजी में पढ़ते हैं. ठीक है. सो सोशल साइकोलॉजी की जो पढ़ाई हम करते हैं इसमें 3 लेवल पर हम लोग देख सकते हैं. पहला लेवल है सबसे नीचे या सबसे नीचे. इसमें एक्चुअली कोई हायरार्की नहीं है, मतलब ये नहीं कि लेवल 1 है तो लेवल 2 से ऊपर है या लेवल 2 से नीचे है, ऐसा कोई हायरार्की नहीं है, बट 3 लेवल्स पे हम लोग सोशल साइकोलॉजी की पढ़ाई कर सकते हैं। पहला है लेवल ऑफ द इंडिविजुअल, जहाँ पे इंडिविजुअल बिहेवियर, मतलब एक सिंगल व्यक्ति का बिहेवियर अगर हम पढ़े और उस पर हम अगर फोकस करें तो हम कहेंगे कि सोशल साइकोलॉजी की जो
Ma'am, can you please keep it in English as it's hard for me to follow.
Yes.
Ma'am, she's saying to keep the lecture in English.
I'm okay with it. Okay, this is a very interesting. Priyansha, can you say that again or type it because I couldn't hear you at all?
Ma'am, Jahanta is saying that to keep the lecture mostly in English. She doesn't know Hindi.
That's what I got. So I was switching to bilingual language because I thought there would be people who are more comfortable in Hindi here. So I'm okay. So who was that? Choki. Choki तो नाम नहीं है वैसे. Anyways, okay, I'll try and switch. Okay. So I'll keep the lecture in English. I don't mind. So when we study at the level of the individual, when we try to discern and understand that how individuals behave in a particular situation and try to learn about the causes and effects of those behaviors, now suppose we try to understand what kind of different prejudices and stereotypes an individual holds, right? So that becomes the level of the individual's kind of study. So when you have a focus in your research method wherein you are more interested in knowing about the individuals, then that's like the level 1 study of social psychology. Level 2 are the interactional processes. So when we are trying to look at the interactions between individuals, and our focus of study is on those interactions where 2 or more people are involved, like for example, why do we fall in love? What are the different processes, which makes us attract to each other? What are attraction process? What are patterns and styles of communication, for example? So when we do such kind of researches where interactional processes are our focus, it becomes level 2 analysis of social psychology. All right. And lastly, when we look at group processes, like at a group level, when we study the nature of these groups and try to describe different kinds of behaviors that take place in a group, that becomes level 3 analysis in social psychology. Examples would be like, why do groups behave in a very polarized manner? Polarized here means that group has this tendency of taking very extreme decisions, right? So why do groups behave like that? What are the different kinds of processes involved with group behavior, like group status, group role? Why do groups engage in prejudice kind of behavior? So these study of focus, when it is on the group level, group behavior understanding of individuals, then it becomes a level 3 analysis in social psychology. So level 1, individual level. Level 2, interaction, where 2 or more people are interacting and we are more focused on interactions. And group processes is level 3, wherein we are trying to understand, or we try to understand the group level behavior. Group means here that collection of people, right? So whenever we are studying collection of people in groups, it becomes level 3 analysis in social psychology. So these are the 3 different levels wherein you will see mostly the theories that we have, the different theories that we have in social psychology mostly would be aligning either to level 1, level 2 or level 3, because that's how we can divide individuals in social situations, going from individual to group level. All right. So this is all about levels of social psychology.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yes.
Ma'am, can you explain what is polarization again?
Okay, so polarization is one process that we will be doing in group in unit 4 in detail. Group, when you are in a group, all right. So what happens that when you are in a collection, when there are many individuals, so individual responsibility is very less, right? While taking any kind of decision, while taking any kind of action. So what happens is that group has a very vulnerable kind of quality. Any group I'm saying, it can be a group of 5-6 people, and it can be a group of very very there's many people together. So groups have this tendency to take extreme decisions or think alike. So groups actually, any group is formed because all those individuals, all those members who are a part of it, they think alike. And because if they're similar thinking, they're very likely to have similar and same kind of opinion. So this is known as polarization. For example, we have actually very extreme examples I can actually give you. Suppose there is a group who believes in one kind of religion, for example. I'm not naming any religion here. And they believe that anybody belonging to that religion, that particular religion that they belong to, are good people, and anybody belonging to any other religion are not good people, not so good people. Right? So suppose they have this thing, I'm giving a hypothetical statement, you can fit any other example also. So they have this thought, they have this stereotype, and they're more likely to think alike and unanimously give one kind of decision or one kind of opinion on the other out group that they are referring to. They would say ki anybody who's from not our group are bad people, for example, if they say. So everybody in the group might give the same opinion, and they give the same opinion because they are not individualized, they are individualized in a group. They don't have individual responsibility, and their tendency to think in a similar manner is very likely in a group. And what happens when they think in a very similar fashion, nobody questions, nobody raises any concern, and they are likely to take extreme decisions. That's why you would see groups can become very violent in nature. That's why whenever you see riots, whenever you see conflicts, we think, why do people engage in such violent behaviors? Because group processes are like that. Because they're thinking very similarly, they have same opinion, we have a thought process which everybody shares, nobody questions. There's likelihood of anybody addressing any concern. So because of their thought process, which is very similar, they can take extreme decisions, and that's why we see groups becoming very violent at times. Mob lynching, these are examples of this kind of polarization. Is that clear?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
No, I am giving a very extreme kind of example. It can be a positive example as well. Alright, so polarization means aligning your thought in a similar manner. All individuals have same polarized thought process. Okay? So going back to the beginnings of social psychology, it's very important to understand social psychology and its history and how it developed as a subject. Since you've not studied psychology, so itna aapko matter nahi karega. It would not be something that would be asked directly, but it is important to understand because social psychology keeps on changing. When I say social psychology keeps on changing, any ideas why it would be? Physics remains the same to a certain point. Economics remains the same. उसमें same चीज पढ़ते हैं. Why do you think social psychology, when I say it keeps changing, it happens? Any idea? Any guesses here? When I say social psychology has been changing since the time it first began.
Because of thinking process, because maybe thinking cannot be constant. How we think.
ठीक है, उस हिसाब से तो psychology as a discipline would change, right? But why do you think thinking process keep changing, or any other behavior keeps changing? Especially हम जब social setting के बारे में बात करें, when we are talking about a social setting or a particular situation. You're on the right direction. Anybody else who would like to speak? Okay, the society that we had in suppose 1950s, is it the same today, 2021?
No, ma'am.
No, ma'am.
No? What are some of the major differences that you can see?
Like, ma'am, now there is the internet and technological improvement.
Can you be a little louder because I can't hear you?
Ma'am, now there is more technological improvement. There is now internet and all this stuff.
Right. So yeah. So those differences have brought about changes in the way we act and behave. Is it? So when I say social psychology itself has undergone a lot of shifts and changes since the time it was formally, first began as a subject, is because of the reason, simple reason, that social settings themselves are not static. They are dynamic in nature. They keep on changing. There are various time related changes that happen. There are various, culture related changes that happen. Right? So because social settings in themselves are not something which are constant or static and they don't remain the same, definitely our behavior, our actions in social situations are going to change because the situation itself has undergone change, right? Has undergone, different kinds of transformations, right? So social settings, because of their dynamic nature, social psychology has also tried to accommodate all those changes, all those transformation in its subject matter, right? And it's not that before social psychology was formally introduced, or people started looking at this discipline in a more academic manner. Social psychology did not exist. It's very similar to that chemistry did not exist before people started studying chemistry, right? Chemicals always existed, or physical process, every time they existed, right? The sun existed already, stars existed, astrophysics existed. Just because you've given a name it as a subject matter, people started studying social psychology about around 1895, 1897. That was 19th century, towards the end of the 19th century. And since then till now, social psychology, as different theories in social psychology have undergone many different transformations. So initially, social psychology, influence of social processes and situations on your behavior, was firstly observed by somebody known as Norman Triplett, right? So Norman Triplett was a psychologist, or a social psychologist, you can say, in late 19th century, and he was one of the first people who formally gave a theory around, not a theory but an observation around uh, social processes impacting your behavior. So let me give you two examples right now. So imagine yourself writing an exam in an examination hall. You must have all given exams, right, before OBE happened. So you're writing an exam in a hall and the invigilator is roaming about, right? So invigilator is taking rounds of the room, and suddenly she stops in front of you and she starts looking at your paper. How did you feel at that point of time? How would you feel at that point of time?
Ma'am, can you please repeat?
You're writing an exam, right? ऐसा होता था ना कभी कभी that you were writing an exam and invigilator would come and stand on your head. Not purposefully, but she's just standing near you. Did it impact your behavior at all? How did it make you feel?
Yes, ma'am, it does. We feel conscious that we are writing something wrong.
You definitely feel conscious that you're writing something. So what happens because of that consciousness that you develop? Either you start writing very fast, or you start thinking, or you start writing in good handwriting. So this is one example of what Norman Triplett studied. Or the very reason you have cheerleaders in sports, right? Why do we have cheerleaders in sports? Any idea? Why do we have cheerleaders? Just for entertainment purposes? Or do you think it can have an impact on the way sportsmen play? क्यों होते हैं cheerleaders sports games में, sports and games में? Have you ever thought of it? Or is it just fancy dance that happens?
Ma'am, to boost the morale.
To boost the morale. So the fundamental process or the reason behind this behavior is that we perform better. That's what Norman Triplett tried to propose. That whenever we are performing individually, so suppose I'm cycling. He carried out many studies, right, and observed many activities. So one of the examples of his studies is that he observed people cycling. So when they were cycling alone, their speed was normal, not very. They were not trying to push the pedal very hard, something like that. But when they were put to cycle with respect to other people, when other people were also cycling, then it was observed that they would push more pedal. They would try to increase their speed, and whenever a social situation and in presence of others, your performance is likely to be increased. And this particular phenomenon he called as social facilitation. So according to Norman Triplett, you perform better, you perform harder when there are people around you. Alright. So this particular thing was known as social facilitation. So this observation, this entire theory, if you can say it, was given in late 19th century, and before that it was never ever thought of that social situation can have an impact. Ayushi, you are almost half an hour late. Right? So are you getting this point? So Norman Triplett's study gave the concept of social facilitation, that individuals or human beings perform better when they are in presence of other people. Right? And this he called as social facilitation. So competitive situations make you conscious, they make you apprehensive because you are being evaluated, and therefore you try and make better performances. Right? Later on there are many criticisms to this theory, but nonetheless this particular concept, this particular theory was one of the first things that was proposed in psychology, in social psychology, and it gave a lot of impetus to future studies, bringing into the minds of different scholars that social situations are very important when it comes to performance and when it comes to influencing behavior. Right? Any questions so far? If you have any question, you can raise your hand. Is the example clear? Is the concept of social facilitation clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So when you're performing alone versus when you're performing in front of others, it is likely that you would perform better and you would do more hard work in presence of others than you would work alone. Right? There were criticisms nonetheless. Alright, so going ahead, there were many people who wrote books on social influences, how social processes influence your behavior. Edward Ross and McDougall being one of them, they published a book in 1898 known as Social Psychology, while an American psychologist, Floyd Allport, published Social Psychology by the same name in 1924. And there was somebody known as Muzaffar Sharif who studied a lot about shared values, group processes, and norms. So these were some of the basic, very, very initial studies and scholars who contributed to the area of social psychology, and that's how the journey of social psychology as a discipline began. Right? Later on, just a second, yeah. Later on, somebody known as Kurt Lewin, he's also known as father of social psychology, gave a very famous equation. We don't actually have many equations in psychology. We don't have to solve anything as such, but this equation does not solve anything but tries to explain the interaction between the environment that you live and the person that you, right? So Kurt Lewin was a was a giant social psychologist, I would say. His contributions are magnanimous when it comes to when it comes to social psychology as a discipline. So he not only tried to incorporate the different kinds of influences and the impact social settings can have on your behavior. He also highlighted various different things that there is importance of forming theories. Before that, people were studying different concepts. They were not much looking at theorization, not much looking at formation of theory. And Kurt Lewin also went a step ahead of forming theories. He said that when we apply those basic principles of different theories, so he also emphasized the importance of, first of all, making theories and then applying them to improve different kinds of situations. Right, so Kurt Lewin gave this equation, which is like if anybody of you has had any lesson in psychology, this is the first equation that we teach in class 11. That B is equal to a product of P and E. P means here the person, the individual characteristics that you have, your own particular special characteristics that you have. Right, as an individual, you would be different from any other person around you. So your individual characteristics, when it comes into interaction with the environment, it leads to your behavior. Let me give you an example here. That suppose there are two people in a classroom. One is very extroverted and the other one is introverted. Right? Extrovert, introvert, you understand, right? And they are placed in a classroom situation. So now their behavior, how they behave, how they interact, how they relate to others would depend definitely on the on the interaction between their personalities and the environment. So, for example, extrovert person, if the situation allows, if the classroom situation, suppose the teacher is not there in the classroom, this is the situation. He would or she would interact a lot, speak loudly, have more friends. So the behavior would be influenced by that. So still, that person would have, would speak more or give more answers or participate more in class. But the environmental condition here has changed, so he cannot, speak loudly now. But nonetheless, his tendency to interact will be more compared to anybody who's introverted. Right? So any introverted in a similar situation would be reserved, would try to withdraw from other people, would not have a very big friend circle, something like that. And even if the teacher enters, class participations would be lesser compared to anybody who's extroverted. So that's what he tried to propose, that our behavior is not only because of what personalities do we have, what qualities do we have, it is also because of the situation. Another very good example actually that would help you to understand the relationship between your personality and your external conditions that you're situated in. For example, you want to ask money from your father. You need money and you want to ask for some money so that you can buy something, right? So you would definitely try to understand the situations. If your father is in a bad mood, you would definitely not go to him and ask for money. Would you do that? Why wouldn't you do that? You need money, you want to ask from your father or mother, for example, and they're in a bad mood. Would you approach them?
No, ma'am.
Why would you not approach them?
Ma'am, because we might get scolded.
You will be getting a scold probably. You will be most likely, because of their bad mood, rejected the money. Right? You would probably not get whatever thing that you wanted. So you would. That's how we operate. That is the level of social psychology in our lives. So we first try to talk to them, improve their mood, and see if they're in a happy mood. Then we are more likely to ask for money so that we get it, right? So these are like very mundane examples I'm giving from daily lives. But yeah, nonetheless, social psychology and observing other people interacting at the right moment, and understanding about the different causes of behavior of different individuals, it's a part of our life. No matter you're a science student or a humanities student or a psychology student, social psychology would influence your behavior because you are a social being. You are situated in a social setting, right? So he gave this equation. He highlighted the importance of the interaction between the personality and the environment. He gave the importance of giving theoretical concepts, and he talked about interventions. So not only by giving theoretical concepts like explaining why people behave in a certain manner would be enough, he went a step ahead that we should also try and implement and help different social situations. So he also gave an entire entire area of research which is known as action research. You would probably learn about it if you are interested in further studies in psychology, and then economics also. I think you would read about action research. So interventions was something that was highlighted, and he coined the term action research. And he okay, one major change that happened compared to the previous excuse me, previous people that I talked about, like Norman Triplett and Edward Ross, that World War II contributed immensely. So Kurt Lewin was also somebody who was studying social psychology, who was proposing theories in social psychology after World War II happened, and he contributed immensely to our understanding of how social situations can contribute, and either they can facilitate or they can also restrict our behavior. So he studied different leadership styles and tried to understand how different leadership styles can motivate people differently. So there is one leadership style which is known as authoritarianism, where the leader has all the task of decision making. So he is not really democratic in his approach. He would rather take the decisions and just tell the subordinates to do a particular task in a certain manner. And there is a different kind of leadership style which is known as laissez-faire, where the leader is not at all bothered about his or her subordinates, right? So he also studied different leadership styles and how it motivated different people differently. And uh, one major contribution of Kurt Lewin during World War II is that he tried to convince people to have a different diet. Actually, this was an intervention uh, that he thought of after seeing different kinds of food crises that people were suffering from. There was food scarcity during World War II. There were resources scarcity. So he influenced people to change their dietary habits, like eat less or eat more carbs or something like that. So he actually believed in applying those understandings that he studied from observing situation around. So, and it would not only help them because dieting is all about the thought process. It's not about restricting your food intake. To restrict your food intake takes a lot of psychological courage, and especially if people are trained to do that, it would help them to survive better. So because there was already food shortage during World War II, if you convince people to eat less and eat whenever hungry and not spend money which is probably not for food and just for satisfying your eating habits, would be a wastage. So he tried to convince people in Europe and to eat less. So this was one of the intervention examples that you can talk about. All right. So these are some of the major contributions that were made initial years में. Nowadays, when you think about social psychology, one major difference between earlier theories of 1950s, theories of 1960s and 70s, is that initially all theories were given without looking into the cultural differences of people. So suppose there was one theory which suggested that we are likely to confirm and change our opinions in front of people if they are suggesting something else than our opinion. We are likely to align with them. They did not consider the importance of cultures. So any theory you pick up before 1970s, 60s, 1970s also, So they did not. They were actually their approach was universal. So they proposed a theory, and they did not consider the fact that that theory would explain behavior better in Western situation, in Western countries like America and Europe, and they would not probably explain the same behavior with the same accuracy in Eastern cultures like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Southeast Asian countries, and things like that. Right? So all theories that were initially proposed in the first half of the century were culturally universal. They did not incorporate any cultural difference or importance of cultural practices that can have an impact on your behavior. Rather, when this particular thing was incorporated in social psychology, nowadays you will see that cultural processes are given a lot of importance when it comes to studying social behavior. Right? So, I give you a very contrasting example I think everybody can relate to. So, in India, we have this culture of living with our parents, right? Growing up, studying, doing your jobs, and still living with your parents. We don't have this tendency of leaving our homes after the age of 18 to be, right? Even if we are married, we live with our parents mostly. This is something unimaginable by any Westerner, by any American, for example. And for them, it would be like, how can you live with your parents beyond 18 years of age? It's something that is very wrong. It's something which is very shocking to them. And for us, leaving your parents after the age of 18 and just being on your own is something very different and very shocking to us, right? So cultural differences and the way you behave and interact would differ because you belong to different cultures. So cultural differences, cultural practices, and their importances were not, first of all, given any importance in initial theories like that in Kurt Levin's theory or Norman Triplett's theory, things like that, right? So did you get my example? Like living with your parents is a very different kind of process. Did you get the example? Can you think of any other example wherein you see a cultural process being an important factor? Example समझ में आया? Did you get the example of how cultural differences can shape different behaviors?
Yes, ma'am.
Any other example? Anybody? Just think of it, right? It's not. That's the advantage of studying social psychology. There are no right or wrong answers here. Think of any example.
Now, I guess about marriages in America and other countries, they can marry at age of 40, 50, whenever they want to. But in India, it's like very restricted that you should get married after 25, I guess. That's also very, key.
Yeah. Apart from the age, I think more difference you could see that a bride for you, find a groom for you in Western cultures. In fact, parents would not do it. You are supposed to find your own partner and get married. Can you imagine that? You can obviously imagine that there are love marriages in India also, but something which is not very, that's something which is not very well acceptable here. Right? Still, we struggle to convince our parents and families to get married on our own. Right? So this is another example actually. And Western countries may parents are not responsible only. They would rather shun away the children. Why can't you find your own partner? They would have that kind of approach. Here in India, only if you are desperately in love with somebody, your parents would listen probably. But this approach is not here. So this is again a difference. Age at which you can get married is different. Number of times you can get married easily is something which is not very easily possible here in India. Or maybe marrying after divorce is not something that's very prevalent in our culture compared to Western culture. So there are many examples actually, not only marriage, even your eating habits, the way you interact. So broadly speaking, Western cultures are individualistic in nature. When I say individualistic, they're more oriented towards the individual's development and choices, while Eastern cultures, not only India but the subcontinental area, Southeast Asian countries, we are holistic in our approach. We think about our families and different families and friends first than ourselves. So our approach is more group oriented, while the approach of Western individuals is more individual appropriated. I'll give you another example. I had a friend of mine who was from Germany, and we went to a restaurant to eat. So usually हम लोग खाना order करते, we order food and we share with our friends, right? It's very normal and natural to share food with your friend. You must have also gone with your family or friends. You eat food, you order food collectively, and then you share it. While I was so surprised that he ordered an entire pizza for himself and ate it by himself. He did not share at all. So, being an Indian person, it would feel very awkward to me, but for him, it was not awkward at all. And the reason being, there are individualistic approaches which are more prevalent in Western cultures than group processes and holistic approach that we follow in our cultures. So we think in relation to others, while most of the thought processes in Western cultures are more individual oriented. Their origin is more about myself, right? Myself, my identity, my development, and my choices. And it's not something that is bad or good. I'm not comparing them, and there cannot be any comparison also that their approach is good or our approach is good. There is no comparison as such, but there are huge cultural differences with respect to the way we behave in different settings. Not only behave in different settings, the way we look at our own selves. So the way I look at myself and identity would be very different from somebody who is probably born in any European country, for example. So self and identity, the way you define yourself is also very different. So therefore, its cultural processes are an important factor that you need to highlight while studying any social behavior. I hope this is clear. So this was one major shift that happened after 1970s, and people started looking at these cultural nuances and processes in social behavior. And nowadays, if you compare theories of social psychology compared to the theories in 50s and 60s, they are more culturally relative than being culturally universal. Any questions so far? Anybody?
No, ma'am.
No, ma'am.
Okay. So as I suggested, social psychology as a discipline is scientific in its approach, and it is not something which is like very mutually exclusive. It is very interdisciplinary, and it borrows elements, it borrows knowledge and theories from, it influences also, and it also borrows from other disciplines in psychology like developmental psychology, personality psychology, cognitive psychology, things like that. And it is very, very similar to two different disciplines which are not a part of psychology, sociology and anthropology. Social psychology, sociology and anthropology are basically referred to as siblings or cousins, I would say. So anthropology is also a study of human behavior in social settings, but their major focus is on the cultural processes there. So they would study individuals and humans as they are closely related to social, the cultural environment. So their major focus, if we compare social psychology and anthropology, their major focus will be to understand the cultural process itself, right? And there is minor emphasis or less emphasis on the study of the human behavior or study of the individual. So this is like one major difference. Anthropology would highlight and learn more about culture and its processes, and less focus would be presented on individuals, while social psychology will have more focus on the individual compared to anthropology. Whereas sociology is a study wherein you try to understand about different social structures and institutions. So it's a study more about social structures and different kinds of institutions that we live in. For example, caste is a social structure, family is a social structure, um, uh, you know, uh, any other example you can. Gender is a social structure. So you have many examples of social structures. So they would study the nature and dynamics of social structures and institutions more so compared to individual or the cultural processes. So their focus on individuals and cultural processes will be lesser compared to anthropology and social psychology. All right. So whenever we do scientific study, we have research methods that probably you also study about in your own respective courses. So research methods, like in any other discipline, any other subject, is also important in social psychology, and there are various ways through which you can investigate behavior in social settings. So experimental research being one of them. एक्सपेरिमेंटल हो गया. आप लोगों ने ये सारी रिसर्च मेथड्स कहीं पहले पढ़ी है? हैव यू एवर हर्ड अबाउट देम इन जनरल साइकोलॉजी आल्सो?
Yes, ma'am.
No, ma'am.
Okay, so some of you have, right? All right, nonetheless, I'll try to explain from scratch. So these are different research methods that we usually use in psychology, I would say, and social psychology examples I will give more in this class. So these research methods would help you investigate different kinds of social phenomena and behaviors in a more systematic manner. So experimental method is one of the most popular methods. Then you have quasi-experimental, field experimental methods. Then you have archival research, survey researches, sociometry, field studies, things like that. So you might get a question from Unit 1, especially asking you about the research methods, right? Coming down to experimental research. So experiment is something which is also common in science. Can somebody explain me what do you understand by experiment? Any science student here? Everybody is a science student here. Explain me. Because this is something that we have borrowed from scientific disciplines. What is an experiment? Anybody? Anybody here from physics or chemistry or any other science, instrumentation, electronics? You do experiments, right? You have practical where you have to do and perform experiments. Now this is something that I'm asking from your own main paper, main course. You should address this.
Ma'am, conducting tests to know something.
But give me an example from your own discipline. What kind of experiments do you conduct? Any one example? I know everybody has an experiment here. Everybody is a science student. Mansi? Come on, experimental study तो आप लोगों को पता होना चाहिए ना. मुझे एक एग्जांपल दीजिए. कोई है यहाँ पे फिजिक्स का स्टूडेंट जो एक्सपेरिमेंट किया हो कभी? Even in class 12th, I would say. No one. Okay, then I'll teach you about psychology only. So experiments are basically ways of investigating to know about cause and effect of two variables, right? अगर आप अपने डिसिप्लिन से एग्जांपल देते तो मैं उसको भी करके दिखाती है, but let's go down to psychology. So any experiment would try and understand how two variables or how two phenomena are related to each other with respect to one causing the other. So cause and effect relationship is something which is studied with experimental research, and the variable that causes that particular effect is known as the independent variable, and the behavior which is being transformed or is being caused is known as the dependent variable. I'll give you a very crude example. For example, if I have a hypothesis that consuming coffee will reduce sleep, right? So independent variable in this particular hypothesis would be amount of coffee, and my dependent variable would be what? Sleep. Right? Suppose I have these two variables. Right? So now I want to investigate whether coffee has an impact on the level of your sleep. So I can have different approach. I can form two groups, and in one group I give them coffee and see its impact on their sleep, and in the other group I don't give any coffee and monitor their sleep, and in the end I can compare the hours or maybe quality of sleep of the two different groups. Right? Can I do that? So this is how you conduct experimental research. So your aim is to find out a relationship between IV, which is known as an independent variable, and DV, and the main characteristic of experimental research is that the researcher is able to manipulate the IV and systematically see its effects on DV. In the same example of coffee and sleep, so I can first give 10 mg coffee, then I can give 20 mg coffee, then I can give 30 mg coffee, and systematically see if there is any reduction in sleep happening or not. Right? So experiments give you a control over independent variable, and the researcher systematically varies it and see its impact on the dependent variable that you're studying through your research. So the major striving of experimental research is to achieve pure cause and effect relationship. Right? So what happens with human research? It's not a physics experiment, it's not a chemistry experiment. What happens with human participants and human research is that there are many other factors that can also have an impact on the behavior. Right? So going back to the same example of coffee and sleep, so I want to see whether coffee can cause lack of sleep or less sleep. So there can be individual differences also in the levels of or the quality of sleep. For example, some individuals can have this tendency of sleeping more compared to some individuals having tendency to sleep less. There can be other metabolic factors also in the body. Suppose some individuals can process coffee in a different manner compared to different individuals. So these other kinds of variables can also have an impact on your results. So what happens is in experimental study, especially in psychology and humanities, is that we need to maximize the variance, the changes and transformations caused by our manipulation of IV, and minimize impact of any other variance caused by any other factor. Like suppose I just mentioned metabolic factors ho gaye, individual factors ho gaye. So this is the aim of our experiment. So what can we do to minimize the effect of different factors which are not IV but still can have an impact on DV, is that we can either control them or we try to remove and eliminate them. For example, external conditions we can definitely control. We have to conduct the experiment in a well ventilated closed room where there is no noise or something like that to distract the individual who's performing. So we use different kinds of strategies to combat these confounding variables that can also have an impact on DV. Right? So one important thing that you have to do in experimental research is to randomize the assignment of IV. All right. So for example, I just mentioned that there may be individuals who have different metabolism process where they can process coffee better compared to some other individual. So I don't want to see that this is because of the metabolic process that I am seeing more sleep in people who process coffee better compared to the other. So what I do is that I randomly assign individuals to the two different groups I talked about. So I spoke about it. We can form two groups. One is known as the experimental group and the other is known as the control group. Experimental group, you introduce the IV. Suppose example, you introduce the coffee, and in control group, there is no IV, there is no coffee. I'm just giving you an example. Coffee is just an example. right? So you randomly put people in these two groups and then see the differences in sleep, right? So there are different ways of randomizing. It's like chit system is one, fishbowl technique कहते हैं जिसको. Yeah, every nth participant, for example, every second participant you get can be assigned a control group, and every odd number participant can be assigned an experimental group, something like that. Right, so you don't have to do that much of detail. Let me give you example of a social psychology experiment. I just give you a very rough and crude example of coffee and sleep. One thing that experiments also allow is manipulation check. First of all, whether they are able to perceive how the manipulation has to take place is something that you can check in experimental researches. And another important feature of experimental psychology is that experimental methods is that you have to bring down the variables in some quantifiable terms. So if I have a hypothesis that, for example, if you sleep 8 hours, you have better dreams. I have this hypothesis, but dreams को measure करने का कोई mechanism नहीं है. So this particular hypothesis will have a poorly designed experiment. So it is better, it's good if you have variables which are more they allow themselves to be quantified to a certain extent. So as I mentioned, there was this experiment actually. What we can do is that I can send you one YouTube link and you can watch about that experiment. So there is this experiment by somebody known as Zimbardo in social psychology. It was carried out in 1969, and it wanted to see the impact of social anonymity on the degree of criminal act. So if you're anonymous, would you engage in more, are you more likely to engage in criminal acts or not? This was one of the concerns and questions, research questions that Zimbardo tried to address, right? So he created two groups in his experiment. So in one group, he had participants. The control group does not have any IV. So there were the participants where their names and identity was revealed. And in the experimental group, participants were given hoods and their identity were concealed. So they wore hoods. They were not visible to the other person. They were not, the individuals could not tell that this is this individual, that individual. Their identity was hidden in experimental group. And my IV in this particular experiment is what? Social anonymity, my hidden identity, my social identity. So experimental group mein, they gave them hoods and their identity was concealed, and control group, their identity was not hidden. And these participants were asked to give electric shocks actually to certain individuals, and it was seen that people whose identity was hidden, they gave more number of shocks and for longer durations of time. These electric shocks were nonetheless not like very 240 volt ka nahi. These were very small electric shocks that they had to give. So they gave the people whose identity were hidden, they gave more electric shock compared to people who were not hidden with their identities. They also gave shocks because they were asked to do that in experiment, but the frequency and the duration was much more, significantly much more in experimental groups where the participants had their identity hidden. And this phenomenon later was known as de-individuation, wherein that in social, when you are anonymous, when your identity is not revealed, it leads to something known as de-individuation, because you're not accountable for your actions. You're not responsible for your actions, and that lack of responsibility and de-individuation that happens because of anonymity can tempt you or can make you engage in criminal activities. One contemporary example is that all those trolling that we see online websites pe ya fir Instagram pe, you see different kinds of trolling happening, right? That's an example of de-individuation only. You're not accountable for your opinions, you're not accountable for hurting any individual. And de-individuation does a very important thing, that because you're not responsible, you don't feel guilty for your action. So any example like social trolling or cyberbullying, all of these are examples of de-individuation happening, right? So this is how you conduct an experiment. You first of all, number one, are interested in investigating the cause and effect relationship between two variables. It is sometimes also when experiments are more complicated, they can be more than one variable also. But simplest experiments tries to see the cause and effect between IV independent variable and DV independent variable. And IV is supposed to be the cause of DV. So if I systematically manipulate IV, I note down the changes that happen in DV. So that's how I manipulate IV and DV. There are two groups that you can form. And also another example of not, suppose there are certain factors which you cannot control at all. So the same individual also can be subjected to different groups, different conditions. So I can suppose the same experiment अगर दूसरे तरीके से मैं करती, so I could have asked the individual to give electric shock once without the hoods and then later with the hood. Then I could have compared the number of shocks that you give in two different conditions. This is also a way you can do your experiment also. And this conditional approach is known as within approach, and the group approach is known as the between approach, where you have two different set of participants in experimental and control group. So only when we have factors which we see that there might be certain factors within individual that cannot be controlled and randomized, then only we proceed further with within kind of approach. Right? So social trolling, online trolling and cyberbullying are great examples of de-individuations and the increase in degree of criminal act that you see. Right? So that's how you do experimental studies. So it's something very new for a lot of individuals here in the class. So if you have any questions, you can right now ask me. I can, because you don't have any tutorial class or something. So if you have any questions, any doubt, anything that you want me to repeat, I can do that. Everything well understood? Because I can't see the screen typing, I can't see. No question? Yes, Harshit.
Ma'am, can you explain IV and DV again? Ma'am, in brief, I guess.
Yeah. So independent variable is that variable that you assume to be the cause of a particular phenomenon that you want to observe. For example, in the very simple thing that I talked about, coffee and sleep, suppose I assume that coffee will lead to lesser amounts of sleep. So in this case, independent is that variable which is manipulated by the researcher in the experiment. And that is assumed to be the cause which will lead to transformations in the DV that I'm trying to observe. So the variable of study is DV, and the variable of manipulation is IV, and I manipulate IV and see its effect on DV. So IV ka effect on DV is seen, and DV how it is transformed because of IV is observed in our experimental research. So coffee and sleep, one example, I think it's very clear. For another example, let me give. I want to see the impact of weather on mood. So what will be my IV here, Harshita?
Weather.
Weather will be my IV, and mood, how different kinds of moods emerge because of the weather, will be my DV. It's again a very rough example. Right, so if it's a lab experiment and I can manipulate the IV, I want to see the systematic changes that occur because of the systematic changes and manipulations I'm doing to the IV here. Like I just gave you example, 10 mg coffee and the hour of sleep, the duration of sleep, for example. Then I increase the amount 20 mg, then duration of sleep. इस तरह से we systematically keep on changing the IV and manipulate the IV and see its impact on DV. Another example I give you is that suppose I want to see the impact of noise on attention of the individual. What will be IV here?
Noise.
Noise, right? And DV would be the level of attention that you pay. So, one important thing that you have to keep in mind while deciding IV and DV for your research is that both of them should, first of all, IV should allow itself to be systematically varied, and DV should be something which should be quantifiable. Attention I cannot simply observe. So, suppose I create a task which measures your attention and see your performance. So, if you perform better in that task, I would say that your attention has been better. So both IV and DV should be operationally defined. They should be in quantifiable terms. So similarly, this social psychology experiment I gave you as an example, this person, Mona Zimbardo, wanted to study the impact of social anonymity on degree of criminal act. So now my IV is social anonymity, right? And degree of criminal act is my DV. And I explained you the study entirely. किस तरह से किया.
Yes, ma'am, this experiment is clear, and that definitions of independent variable and DV is also clear.
Okay. So read more about it in the books. More or less, just remember very simple examples of coffee, noise, weather. These are very simple examples. We don't do it in psychology as frequently, but very simple examples to help you understand of the nature of experiments. All right. So moving ahead, we still have, okay, what we can do is that you can also read about advantages and disadvantages. Advantages is that you can see cause and effect relationship in lab experiments. I'll come back to advantages and disadvantages once we do one more kind of experiment. So social psychology, as I've been repeating since my previous class also, that social situations and settings are very important, are the central heartbeat of actually this discipline. Right, so field studies become very important in social psychology. One of the ways of doing field studies is through field experiment. What happens in field experiment is everything is same. IV, DV, we try to do same randomization thing. We try to operationalize the variables. Everything remains the same. The basic way of conducting a study remains the same. Just that your setting of the study will change. So the earlier studies, the method I mentioned is conducted in lab settings, while field experiments are conducted in natural settings, in field settings. Right, so this is the major difference between field experiments and lab experiments, wherein everything remains the same, just that your setting of the study would change. I'll give you one example of one of the studies that has been done using field experiment as research method. So somebody known as Smith in 1982, along with his colleagues, tried to study whether interpersonal contact will increase compliance. So now who will tell me what is IB and what is DV in this particular question? Whether interpersonal contact will increase what is the term compliance? Does anybody here know what compliance means?
Ma'am, it's right to agree.
That's an act or action individual request. Whether you agree to somebody's request or not. Compliance and compliance. You have an assignment, you are most likely to. I mean, request of individual in was held in a mall-like setting. Just imagine like a mall, you going to a mall, and this particular study was carried out there. And request. होता ना malls में when you and there are different free trials where please try our product and see whether it's good and then only buy. You have the schemes, right, in malls. So what they did was that half of the time when they touch and they touch and other 50% of them or the driving see that contact the person. Yeah, the person. They try to give comments on your beauty, that you're very beautiful, तारीफ करेंगे आपके. So these are the strategies that shopkeepers imply, not shopkeepers but people do engage in so that their request is accepted. So here also in the study, interpersonal contact was manipulated IV through touch, while touch was given to half of the population, half of the sample, and touch was not given to half of the sample, remaining half of the sample, and their acceptance of the request was compared. So this is what a field study looked like. Any question here? Everything remains the same, just that setting changes. So that's why you would see that when you go and buy products, they would be very nice to you. So they are trying to establish interpersonal contact so that you comply with their request of buying the product, right? So this is just one example of field experiment. Any question here? Did you understand the study? Any doubt in the understanding of study or in the process of field experiment? It's everything is same, just that you study or do your experiment in a field setting, natural setting. Okay? So now when we compare advantages and disadvantages of lab experiment and field experiment, is that दोनों में, in both of them, you try to establish cause and effect relationship, but generalizability and applying your experimental research in real life setting is more in field experiments, because you have conducted your study in natural setting, and lab settings are more artificial. So it can be questioned that people might not behave in the same manner in real life settings as they do in lab settings. So when it comes to the applications and generalizing your results in general population, it would be more in experimental studies and lesser in lab experiments. Alright, so I will be putting up these notes. If you can, just treat them as carry cases. Okay, read about these two methods from the books as well. I think Pallavi ma'am has already given you a book to read. Have you got any book to read on social psychology? Come on, इसमें तो yes or no बताओ. So I'll stop here. I don't do all the methods today. I'll stop here. Any concern, any observation that you want to share?